What?
Okay, so Kevin, I'll be asking you some questions on World War II right about now. Okay,
Go
Kevin?
on. Go
Alright,
on.
so how did World War II start?
World War II started with the German invasion of Poland in 1939, September 1st, 1939. And it was basically their attempt to seize Danzig, a German city, uh, a Polish, originally German city that had been transferred to Poland after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And this city was going to connect the two German provinces of Ostpreußen, or East Prussia, and West Prussia.
Why did Hitler hate the Jews so much?
There are several theories to this. One of them is that, well, Hitler's parents had an affair with a Jew, and the other is just pure Nazi rhetoric. The reason why the Nazis hated the Jews was because they believed that the Germans had been betrayed by the Jews during World War One. It wasn't the fact that the Allies had a superior army. It wasn't due to the fact that the Germans were getting kind of sick of a war that was supposed to end in 1 year, however, it took over 4. And no, it was the Jews. They had betrayed Germany. They'd been stabbed in the back by the Jews, and they were the sole reason to blame for Germany losing World War One. So,
Okay, what is
yeah.
known as the Battle of Britain?
Battle of Britain was essentially an air battle fought mostly by fighter planes and bombers over the skies of Britain from 1940 to late 1940. It happened over after the fall of France, when Germany essentially attempted to bomb Britain into submission and used blitz tactics with their bombers to non-discriminately bomb London. And
What are the Blitz?
well,
What is the Blitz?
it was just heavy bombing strategy
Okay,
that
so
happened during the Battle of Britain.
some
Yeah.
so it was the bombing attacks were on London, right?
Yes, but not just London, though it was the most heavily affected. There were other cities, including Manchester, um, including, I guess, Edinburgh? Though that's pretty far north.
When did most
And
air
yes,
raids
so
take place?
when?
Yeah, like what time during the day?
Night.
How are people warned that air raids was about to take place?
Well, depending on the area you lived in, sometimes the bombings would just be non-stop. For example, during London. However, there would always be some sort of air siren raids that would sound. Well, it would be quite unpleasant to say the least. In fact, I'm just going to look up air siren sounds because there's no other sound quite like it in the world. So,
Do you want me to read you something?
that's the sound of danger. Sometimes they were hand cranked, other times they were operated from the top of buildings. Either way, this was the sound that people heard whenever they knew there was going to be a bombing and they had to hide in their shelters.
Well, some other cities that were bombed were Swansea, Cardiff, Bristol, Southampton, Plymouth, Birmingham, Coventry, and Liverpool.
Yeah, basically large English cities.
How many people died during World War II Blitz in Britain?
I'm not actually sure about the amount of people who died just during the Blitz. However, I do know that the casualties of World War II exceed 80 million.
80 million. That's a lot of people.
Yes, it actually is. Especially considering the population of the world at the time had not even reached 7 million.
What was
7 billion, sorry. So that was 3% of the 1940 world population,
what
which
was
is
it
quite
like
significant.
for children in the Second World War?
Well, depends on the country you're living in. In the Americas, life was relatively normal. Of course, there were war bonds and even some rationing happening in some areas. But the
What about
just
what happened to children that were Jews?
Jews living in Nazi Germany were essentially going to die. They were, unless they were able to hide, like Anne Frank did, she almost lived. But unless you were able to hide, you were almost certainly going to die either from a Nazi death camp, work camp, you were going to be sent to the front as slave labor, or you were simply going to be shot. For example, there was a city in the lowlands in Belgium where they had rounded up the entire town, put all the men and women in a garage to be shot, then put all the women and children in a church, rigged explosives to the church, and blew the whole thing up, essentially exterminating an entire town.
Wow, that's pretty brutal.
Yes, it is. That's the Nazis for you.
And what is the Battle of the Coral Sea?
Battle of Coral Sea was a battle that took place, I believe, 1942, though it could have been late 1941. It was essentially a showdown of naval and air power between the U.S. and Japan. It was one of the major battles of the Pacific.
Okay.
Yeah. 1942, there we go. 98
A
aircraft
few
destroyed.
more well-known battles.
Um,
Can you just name some for me? That happened
Okay.
during World War II?
well-known battles, well, I suppose these are going to happen past 1942, where we're supposed to cover it for a project. But I cannot think of a better example of World War II than the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, where the entirety of the German Sixth Army was cut off, trying to capture that city, and killed. Well, not killed, but, they were essentially wiped out. There were other battles, like the Battle of Kursk, the Battle of
Pearl Harbor?
Saipan. Pearl Harbor was not actually a battle; it was more of a raid by the Japanese onto American soil, which brought the brought the Americans into battle. There was also, it wasn't exactly one battle, but the battle for France was also a very important one because it knocked out the French very early on into the war. Only 6 weeks. Can you imagine that? And they're fighting a war for 6 weeks before giving up.
What were the allies? What were World War II allies, like leaders? What were the leaders?
So the different sides of World War II essentially were the Allies and the Axis. That's what Josh was referring to, I believe. If so, then the Allies of World War II would be the U.S., whose president at the time was Delano Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain. Charles de Gaulle was the leader of Free France, a movement that popped up after the French government had capitulated to the Germans. What else was that? He was later elected Prime Minister of France after the war ended. Adolf Hitler was the leader of Nazi Germany. He was fighting, obviously, against the Allies. On Germany's side was Benito Mussolini, who was the leader of the Italians. Emperor Hirohito was the emperor of the Japanese, and Emperor Puyi was the leader of the Manchurians, who were a puppet state that the Japanese set up.
Was Joseph Stalin an Axis or an ally?
Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union, and I'm very glad that you brought this up, because though he did fight against the Nazis as they had invaded his lands in 1941, he was not truly a member of the Alliance, and was actually part of a different one called Communist International, or the Comintern. And, well, they had the purpose of spreading world revolution, and after the Nazis were taken out, you better believe that Stalin was looking for every opportunity he could have to take out the West as well. But for World War II purposes, yes, they fought on the same side, so I guess you could consider him part of the Allies.
Okay, so what was their entertainment?
Entertainment in that time? Well, people would go to movies, they would listen to music. Nothing like the internet, obviously, that they had in the 1940s. They just go out and play. I'm not a huge expert on this. I'm more of a military part, World War II.
Okay,
Like,
well, changes since the war.
you're asking for the impacts of World War II?
Mm-hmm.
So, after the war ended, several treaties were signed. The Treaty of San Francisco ended the war as a whole. So that's the one I believe is most important. Because after Germany surrendered, Japan kept on fighting until America had nuked the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And when this was signed, a couple of things took into place. One, Manchuria was occupied by the Soviets and given to the Chinese. The Korean Peninsula was split in half between Soviet Union and the Americans. And, well, we can still see the effects of that division to this day in the forms of North and South Korea. Germany was also divided in half, with East and West Germany. Well, Actually, during that time, it was different occupation zones in the military. France, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union all took their parts in occupying Germany, which would then become the states of East and West Germany. And finally, the map of Europe was redrawn, and so was the Africans. And finally, the most important part, America became a world superpower, which is how we are, which the situation we're in today. America being the most powerful country in the world.
Okay, so what did Adolf Hitler do to the Jews when he got them?
Like I said before, extermination.
Okay, and what type of extermination?
They were brought to they were brought to work camps, concentration camps such as Auschwitz. They were shot directly. Sometimes, not mostly though. I imagine being children, Hitler didn't have them all killed immediately, but they were definitely sent to work camps where they would starve to death, as Anne Frank eventually did. That's the limit of my knowledge on that subject. I'm not very familiar with the Holocaust as a topic.
So that sums up our part of what we need to do for this project. And thank you for watching. I mean Guac Talk with Kevin Chan.
Oh yeah, and don't forget to sub to my man D4 Parish here on Twitch. What was your Twitch again?
Follow me on twitch.tv/D4Parish. I'll link it in the bio.
Alright.
Stop recording.